Warren Buffett spent 20 years and $47 billion building a philanthropic partnership with Bill Gates and ended it the same month the Justice Department's Epstein files put Gates's name back in print. I am Lambert Woollingham, and this is the Daily Share for Wednesday, July 15th. My fleece is holding up better than most of today's numbers, which is not saying much. Closer to home, Central Texas spent the day on the unglamorous business of government, the kind measured in unopened envelopes and unfilled seats. Taylor County commissioners have approved $27,000 for a public campaign whose entire purpose is convincing residents to show up for jury duty. The expense follows a formal complaint from 104th District Judge Jeff Probst, who told the county that summons response rates have fallen so low they are now disrupting the court calendar outright. That shortfall recently forced a scheduled trial to be postponed when too few prospective jurors bothered to appear for selection. The county used to get by on a historical response rate of 16 to 20%, which tells you what passes for a functioning baseline in the local justice system. Nobody at the county has explained yet what the $27,000 will actually buy to reverse the trend of ignored mail, though presumably it involves convincing people that a jury summons is not, in fact, junk mail. The Department of Energy has approved a $3.26 billion loan to AEP Texas to rebuild the regional grid across West Texas, funding around 100 separate projects and nearly 2,800 miles of new transmission line. Federal officials say the work will double power delivery capacity in the region, which happens to be exactly what is needed to keep feeding the Permian Basin's oil and gas operations. The loan lands at the same moment the state is straining to keep up with the electricity demands of new artificial intelligence data centers, though Energy Secretary Chris Wright insists residents will still save $685 million over the next 3 decades. Meanwhile, Governor Abbott and other state lawmakers are floating moratoriums and tax rollbacks aimed at forcing those same data centers to build their own private power systems instead of leaning on the public grid. It is a lot of new wire for a problem the state is simultaneously trying to make someone else's. New Braunfels has installed Nathan Brown as acting city attorney, closing a 2-month vacancy in the city's legal department. The personnel shuffle traces back to a fractured 4-3 vote in May that ousted former city attorney Valeria Acevedo after officials discovered the municipal charter conflicted with the Texas Constitution over how the city was administering its own mayoral race. It took 2 months and one outside firm to fill a job whose previous occupant was let go for not noticing the city charter contradicted state law. The council made the new appointment in closed session while simultaneously firing Davidson, Troilo Ream, and Garza, the outside firm that had been running the office on an interim basis since late May. Going forward, the city says it will only call in outside counsel for specialized work, returning day-to-day legal guidance in-house. Tarrant County commissioners voted 3-1 to formally honor the South Lake Carroll Independent School District for suing the Department of Education over Title IX protections for transgender students. The 2024 lawsuit argued the Biden administration had exceeded its authority by extending civil rights protections to cover gender identity, and while the Supreme Court bypassed that specific case, it later adopted similar reasoning in a separate ruling permitting states to bar transgender girls from female school sports. Republican Commissioner Matt Krause introduced the local resolution and described the district's legal campaign as administrative common sense. Dozens of residents showed up for public comment, split between supporters of the ban and opponents who argued the county was formally endorsing something that endangers transgender students. Democratic Commissioner Roderick Miles cast the lone dissenting vote, which was enough to register an objection and nowhere near enough to stop it. Capital Metro is holding public hearings on its first fare increase since 2015, a phased hike that would take the base bus fare from $1.25 to $1.50 in January of 2027, then to $2 by 2029. Commuter rail and express tickets would climb from $3.50 to $4 and eventually to $5. The proposal arrives just as Capital Metro's outsourced mechanics and bus drivers are threatening to authorise a strike over stalled wage talks. That leaves the agency asking riders to pay more for a service its own workers are not paid enough to keep operating. Transit officials blame inflation and the rising cost of running an expanding regional network, saying the sales tax revenue that normally subsidises the system is no longer enough to keep the fleet running. The economics section moves from a Senate confirmation hearing to a slowdown in Beijing, with the Federal Reserve parked somewhere in the middle, committing to nothing in particular. Todd Blanche appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee for his confirmation hearing to become the permanent Attorney General, a job he has already been doing on a trial basis as Deputy Attorney General. In that role, he oversaw a purge of career prosecutors and redirected the department's priorities toward the president's political opponents, which senators are now expected to ask him about at length. Blanche's main credential for the job appears to be his prior career as President Trump's personal defense attorney. Resume line lawmakers will have to decide counts as independents. If confirmed, he would formally erase what used to be a boundary between the Justice Department's prosecutorial decisions and the president's personal legal interests. Senators will use the hearing to determine whether that boundary was ever load-bearing to begin with. China's economy grew just 4.3% in the second quarter, missing Beijing's target and posting its weakest number since the end of pandemic lockdowns in 2022. Exports jumped 27% in June on demand for artificial intelligence hardware, but domestic retail sales crept up only 1% and new home prices kept falling. It is not the kind of imbalance a stimulus package fixes overnight, leaving the world's second largest economy leaning almost entirely on foreign buyers to keep its growth numbers from collapsing further. The war in the Middle East is adding its own strain, pushing up the cost of imported oil at a time when Chinese manufacturers cannot pass those costs on to a retail market too financially insecure to absorb a price hike. The United States inflation rate cooled to 3.5% in June, with the consumer price index dropping 0.4% month over month, the sharpest one-month decline since the start of the pandemic in April 2020. Core inflation eased too, down to 2.6% from 2.9% the month before, and the whole improvement traces back to a 5.7% collapse in energy prices during a brief ceasefire between the United States and Iran. Markets cheered the numbers as vindication for the Federal Reserve's restrictive policy right up until the ceasefire collapsed, the naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz went back up, and oil prices resumed climbing. In other words, the June inflation report measured a world that stopped existing sometime around its release date. Hedge funds liquidated at their fastest pace in 2 years during the first quarter, with 129 funds shutting down compared to just 45 the quarter before. In the same 3 months, 166 new funds launched because nothing discourages a hedge fund manager quite like watching 129 of his peers fail. The benchmark tracking the top 500 hedge funds still posted a solid 7.1% gain through the first half of the year, even as individual managers got wiped out by sudden correlation spikes and forced deleveraging. The aggressive turnover creates a boom and bust cycle running inside the same quarter. Fresh capital is now arriving just in time to buy whatever the last round of failures left behind. Federal Reserve Chairman Kevin Warsh gave his first monetary policy testimony to Congress since taking the job, and true to the pattern of his short tenure so far, he committed to almost nothing specific. Warsh told both chambers the rate-setting committee remains focused on restoring price stability and will not tolerate persistently high prices, language that sounds firm without actually describing a single upcoming decision. Lawmakers pressed him on whether recent swings in the consumer price index would trigger a rate hike or another pause, and he declined to say, preserving what he apparently considers strategic ambiguity. All of this unfolds while the executive branch keeps publicly pressuring the Federal Reserve to cut borrowing costs, which Warsh is resisting rhetorically while giving markets nothing concrete to price in. I will admit a personal weakness here. Artificially cheap money is the one subject that can get a mild-mannered Ovis genuinely worked up, and a central bank that will not even commit to a direction is doing nothing to help my blood pressure. Overseas and elsewhere, the day gets heavier before it gets stranger, starting with the toll from a fire in Bangkok's nightlife district. The death toll from the fire at a Bangkok music venue has risen to 32 after 2 more victims died of their injuries in the hospital. The blaze tore through the Rong Bir Na Lad Prao bar late Sunday night, trapping hundreds of patrons inside as it burned. More than 70 people suffered severe burns or smoke inhalation in the panic that followed, with at least 30 remaining hospitalized in critical condition. Investigators found that most of the dead had crowded into windowless bathrooms, looking for shelter from smoke that had nowhere to go. It is Bangkok's deadliest fire in nearly 2 decades, and the city has now ordered a safety audit of similar venues, the kind of review that tends to arrive only after systemic code violations have already cost lives. 2 civil rights organizations have filed suit in a Manhattan federal court, arguing the Trump administration's use of international sanctions violates the First Amendment. The challenge targets a 2025 executive package that imposed financial and travel penalties on International Criminal Court officials, a United Nations expert, and several Palestinian human rights groups. The plaintiffs say the sanctions are so broadly written that they effectively criminalize ordinary diplomatic advocacy and legal coordination, and that the policy has already pushed American researchers and lawyers to cut professional ties with sanctioned foreign entities just to avoid prosecution at home. The lawsuit accuses the administration of turning the Treasury Department's enforcement powers into a tool for silencing domestic dissent about foreign conflicts. A federal court must now decide whether the president's foreign policy authority outweighs a citizen's right to simply talk to someone the government does not like. Supreme Court Justices Elena Kagan and Amy Coney Barrett testified before Congress again this week. The first time members of the court have appeared on the Hill since 2019, this time asking for a $228 million budget built around a 10% increase driven almost entirely by $14.6 million in additional security. The request follows a 38% rise in threats against the court and would fund 6 more protective agents for every sitting justice. Justice Barrett told lawmakers she was recently targeted by an armed swatting hoax at her own home, and described explaining to her teenage children why she now has to wear a bulletproof vest in public. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle seemed receptive. They appear to have accepted that the judicial branch now requires the kind of hardened perimeter usually reserved for the executive. Warren Buffett has cut off the pipeline of money that sent $47 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation over 2 decades, ending a philanthropic partnership he pledged to maintain for life back in 2006. The 95-year-old Berkshire Hathaway chairman says he will instead put his remaining $140 billion into 4 family-run trusts, all of it to be spent down by 2034. He has not offered an explicit reason for the change, though the announcement comes just weeks after Justice Department files detailed Bill Gates's extensive ties to Jeffrey Epstein, and Buffett has said plainly he would like to avoid any legal entanglements or witness summons of his own. The Gates Foundation, for its part, is now left to run entirely on its namesake's personal fortune, which is either a vote of confidence or the opposite, depending on how you read a sudden and permanent silence. Senate Democrats blocked the $1.15 trillion defense authorization bill in a procedural vote that failed 50 to 46, well short of the 60 needed to advance. Minority Leader Chuck Schumer framed the blockade as a constitutional objection, arguing Congress should not authorize a historic expansion of the Pentagon's budget while the president wages an unauthorized war against Iran. The vote landed the same day the White House announced it had reinstated a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, which Democrats said made passing the funding bill look like an endorsement of unilateral airstrikes. It is one way to find out how much of the defense budget was ever really optional, given that the blockade leaves the Pentagon managing an expanding multi-front naval campaign without the budget it actually asked for. Taylor County is paying $27,000 to convince people to open an envelope. Spread across the county's population, that is not a small amount of money to spend teaching adults to check their mail, and it raises the obvious question of what happens if it does not work. Presumably the next round involves door knocking, then a raffle, then parking validation, then a small commemorative pin, until eventually the summons itself needs a promotional campaign to advertise the promotional campaign. At some point, the county will spend more money convincing people to serve on a jury than it would cost to simply pay them for showing up, which might have been the answer from the start. I once got out of jury duty back in Wellington by mentioning, truthfully, that I am a sheep, so I recognise a jurisdiction that has not found its own version of that loophole yet. Capital Metro wants riders to pay more for a bus system it cannot currently guarantee will have drivers, given the strike vote hanging over the same wage negotiations that are supposed to fund these fare hikes. The phased schedule runs all the way to 2029, assuming there is still someone behind the wheel to collect it. I am off to go check my own mailbox on the off chance Taylor County already found my address. Lambert, Woollingham. The day has been shorn until tomorrow.